There's something magical about the sound of water lapping against the shore. For the man who lived in the little cabin by Lake Evergreen, that sound was everything. It was his morning alarm clock, his evening lullaby, and the constant reminder that life didn't always have to move at breakneck speed. His name isn't important here. Let's just call him the guy with the cabin. He wasn't rich or famous, but he had something money couldn't buy: peace. Or at least, he thought he did. The cabin sat on the edge of a quiet lake surrounded by thick woods. The air smelled like pine trees, and the only sounds you'd hear were birds chirping and the occasional splash of fish jumping out of the water. To get there, though, you had to cross a small wooden bridge. This bridge wasn't fancy, it was old, creaky, and looked like it belonged in a black and white movie. But it worked fine, and for years, no one complained. This place wasn't exactly remote. It was part of a gated community filled with vacation homes owned by people from the city. Most of them visited once or twice a year, if that. They'd show up, grill some steaks, take selfies by the lake, and leave before the mosquitoes got too bad. The guy with the cabin, however, was different. He actually lived there full-time during certain months. He fished, chopped wood, read books, and enjoyed the simple things in life. He even paid his dues to the Homeowners Association, HOA, just like everyone else. But while the other homeowners came and went, he stayed put, making the most of what he called paradise. Things started going downhill when the HOA decided they wanted to improve the area. At first, it sounded harmless enough. They talked about repainting fences, planting flowers, and maybe upgrading the clubhouse. Nothing too crazy. Then one day, they announced their big plan, tearing down the old bridge and replacing it with a brand new one. According to them, the current bridge was unsafe and needed an overhaul, a project that would cost thousands of dollars, which all the homeowners would have to chip in for. Now the guy with the cabin wasn't thrilled about this idea. Sure, the bridge was old, but it still worked. No one had ever gotten hurt crossing it, and it wasn't falling apart. When he asked why they couldn't just fix the existing structure, instead of tearing it down completely, the HOA brushed him off. It's for everyone's safety, they said. We're modernizing the community. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't really about safety. It felt more like control, a way for the HOA to flex its muscles and remind everyone who was boss. Tensions grew between him and the HOA board. They saw him as difficult, someone standing in the way of progress. He saw them as overreaching bullies trying to force unnecessary changes. Still, he figured it was just talk. People argue all the time. Nothing usually comes of it. So he went about his business, assuming the worst-case scenario would be paying a few extra bucks for a new bridge. But then, one crisp autumn morning, everything changed. He woke up early, as usual, brewed himself a cup of coffee, and stepped outside to enjoy the view. That's when he noticed something strange. There were trucks parked near the bridge, big ones, with hydraulic arms and heavy machinery. Men in hard hats were already hard at work, tearing planks off the railing and tossing them into a pile. The guy couldn't believe his eyes. They were demolishing the bridge without warning. No notice, no discussion, nothing. Just straight-up destruction. His heart sank. Without that bridge, he was effectively trapped. Sure, there was another way. Into the property, a narrow dirt path through the woods, but it wasn't practical for regular use. And besides, it belonged to him. He'd bought that strip of land years ago, thinking it might come in handy someday. Never in a million years did he imagine it would become the center of a battle. Furious and confused, he marched over to the construction site. "What's going on?" he demanded, waving his arms at the workers. One of them shrugged and pointed toward a clipboard-wielding supervisor. The supervisor barely glanced up from his phone. "Orders from the HOA," he muttered. Can't stop now. The guy tried calling the HOA president, but no one answered. Emails went unanswered, too. By the end of the day, the bridge was gone, reduced to a pile of splintered wood and twisted metal. All that remained was a gaping hole where the entrance used to be. Standing there, staring at the wreckage, he felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. How could they do this? Didn't they realize how much this affected him? He wasn't just another seasonal visitor. He relied on that bridge every single day. Now, thanks to their reckless decision, he was stranded. Cut off from the world. At first, he thought about giving up. Maybe he should sell the cabin and move on. But the more he thought about it, the angrier he got. If they thought they could treat him like this, they were wrong. Dead wrong. And that's when an idea began to form in his mind, an idea that would change everything. The guy with the cabin didn't sleep much that night. His mind was racing, replaying the events of the day over and over again. The sight of the demolished bridge, the indifferent shrug of the construction supervisor, the silence from the HOA, all gnawed at him. He felt like he'd been backed into a corner, but deep down, he knew there had to be a way out. A way to fight back. As dawn broke, he stepped outside with a cup of coffee in hand. The air was crisp and the lake shimmered under the morning sun. Normally, this view would calm him, but not today. Today it just reminded him of how isolated he now was. Without the bridge, his once idyllic retreat felt more like a prison. But then something caught his eye, a narrow dirt path winding through the woods on the far side of his property. It wasn't much, but it was there. And it belonged to him. Years ago, when he bought the cabin, he'd also purchased that strip of land as an afterthought. At the time, it seemed useless, a scrappy patch of trees and mud that no one else wanted. But now, it was his ace in the hole. The only other way in or out of the gated community ran right through it. What the HOA didn't know was that he'd recently installed a heavy-duty gate across the path. He'd done it for practical reasons to keep hunters and hikers off his property, but now it was going to serve a much bigger purpose. He smiled to himself as the idea took shape. If they thought cutting off access to his cabin was acceptable, why shouldn't he return the favor? By noon, he'd made up his mind. Grabbing a toolbox and some supplies, he headed down to the dirt path. The gate was already sturdy, but he reinforced it just to be sure. Then, he added a thick chain and a padlock so strong it could probably survive a hurricane. Finally, he hammered a weatherproof sign onto the gatepost. Asterisk, asterisk, private property, no trespassing. Asterisk, asterisk. Standing back to admire his work, he felt a surge of satisfaction. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about sending a message. They wanted to play hardball? Fine. He could play harder. It didn't take long for the chaos to unfold. Next morning, cars started lining up near the entrance to the gated community. People honked their horns, got out to inspect the situation, and quickly realized there was no way in or out except through the dirt path. And that path? Well, it was firmly blocked by the guy with the cabin. At first, people assumed it was a mistake. Maybe he hadn't noticed the bridge was gone. Or maybe he'd forgotten the gate was locked. Someone knocked on his door, explaining the predicament politely. "We really need access," they said. "Can you unlock the gate?" He listened patiently, nodded, and then gave them a flat no. Word spread fast. By afternoon, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Some people were angry, others frustrated, and a few seemed almost amused by the absurdity of it all. One woman stormed up to his cabin, hands on her hips. "Do you realize what you're doing?" she demanded. "You're holding us hostage." He leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed. "Funny," he replied. "That's exactly how I felt when you guys tore down my bridge," she sputtered, unable to come up with a good comeback. Others tried reasoning with him, offering to pay for repairs, or promising to include him in future decisions. But he wasn't interested in empty promises. Not anymore. Things escalated quickly. A group of homeowners gathered outside his cabin, shouting and arguing among themselves. Someone called the police, hoping they'd force him to open the gate. When the officers arrived, they listened to both sides and ultimately told the crowd there wasn't much they could do. The path was private property, and unless someone could prove otherwise, the guy with the cabin had every right to block it. This news sent shockwaves through the community. For years, the HOA had operated like an untouchable authority, making decisions without question. Now, suddenly, they were powerless. And everyone knew who to blame. As the days passed, life inside the gated community became increasingly chaotic. Delivery trucks couldn't get through, garbage collection stopped, and even emergency services struggled to reach the area. Residents began venting their frustrations on social media, calling the guy with the cabin unreasonable, selfish, and stubborn. Behind closed doors, though, many of them admitted he had a point. The HOA had acted recklessly, and now they were paying the price. Meanwhile, the guy adapted to his new reality. He stocked up on groceries, filled extra water jugs, and made plans to use a small boat he kept docked by the lake if he needed supplies. Being cut off wasn't ideal, but it wasn't unbearable either. In fact, he found a strange kind of freedom in it. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was in control of his own life again. But the real turning point came when the HOA president showed up at his door. This wasn't just any visit, it was a desperate plea. The president, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a perpetually harried expression, looked genuinely frazzled. "Please," he begged. "We'll fix the bridge. Just let us through." For a moment, the guy considered relenting. After all, this was partly what he wanted, to make them see reason. But then he remembered how dismissive they'd been before, how they'd bulldozed ahead without listening to anyone. Shaking his head, he stood firm. "Not yet," he said. "When I see real action, not words, I'll think about it." The president left empty-handed, muttering under his breath. But the guy with the cabin didn't care. He knew the game wasn't over, it was just beginning. And for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. The standoff between the guy with the cabin and the HOA dragged on longer than anyone expected. Days turned into weeks, and what started as a tense disagreement quickly spiraled into an all-out war of wills. The gated community, once a quiet retreat for weekend getaways and lazy summer afternoons, had become a battleground. And while the guy with the cabin seemed unfazed by the chaos he'd unleashed, the same couldn't be said for his neighbors. At first, people tried to brush off the inconvenience. "It's just temporary," they told themselves. "He'll cave soon." But as time went on, the reality of the situation sank in. Without access through the dirt path, life in the neighborhood ground to a halt. Delivery trucks carrying groceries, furniture, and packages couldn't make it through. Garbage piled up because waste management services refused to trek through the woods. Even emergency responders struggled to reach the area, leaving residents uneasy about their safety. For some, the frustration boiled over into anger. Neighbors gathered in small groups, whispering heatedly about how unreasonable the guy was being. They called him stubborn, selfish, and every other insult they could think of. A few even threatened legal action, vowing to take him to court if he didn't unlock the gate. Others took their complaints online, posting scathing reviews of the community and warning potential buyers to stay away. "Who wants to live somewhere where you can't even get in or out?" one post read. Another simply said, "This place is cursed." But not everyone felt the same way. Some residents quietly admired the guy's determination. Sure, His methods were extreme, but they understood where he was coming from. After all, the HOA had bulldozed the bridge without warning how. Was that any better? These folks kept their opinions to themselves, though. No one wanted to risk becoming the next target of the HOA's wrath. As for the guy with the cabin, he adapted surprisingly well to the isolation. He stocked up on non-perishable food, filled extra water jugs, and made plans to use a small boat. Docked at the lake if he needed supplies. Being cut off wasn't easy, but it wasn't unbearable either. In fact, he found a strange kind of peace in it. For years he'd craved solitude, longing for a simpler life away from the noise and drama of the outside world. Now, whether by choice or circumstance, he finally had it. Still, living in a bubble came with its challenges. Supplies dwindled faster than he anticipated, forcing him to ration carefully. Trips to town via the lake were time-consuming and exhausting, especially when the weather turned bad. And while he tried to stay focused on the bigger picture, there were moments when doubt crept in. Was he pushing too hard? Could he have handled things differently? Meanwhile, the HOA scrambled to regain control. Meetings were held almost daily, each one more chaotic than the last. Board members argued over who was to blame for the mess, pointing fingers and shifting responsibility. Some suggested offering the guy a settlement cash or repairs to win him over, but others dismissed the idea as giving in. Legal counsel was brought in, contracts reviewed, and contingency plans drawn up. Yet despite their best efforts, nothing seemed to work. Every attempt to negotiate ended in failure, and every threat fell on deaf ears. Frustrated and running out of options, the HOA decided to escalate the situation. They filed a lawsuit against the guy, accusing him of obstructing public access and causing financial harm to the community. It was a bold move, meant to intimidate him into submission. But instead of backing down, the guy doubled down. With the help of a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman known for taking on powerful organizations, he countersued, alleging that the HOA had violated his rights by destroying the bridge without proper notice or consent. Now, the conflict wasn't just personal, it was legal. Both sides dug in their heels, preparing for a long and costly battle. The HOA poured money into hiring top-notch attorneys, confident they could crush the guy with sheer firepower. But he wasn't intimidated. If anything, the lawsuit only strengthened his resolve. He began documenting everything: emails, meeting notes, photos of the demolished bridge, recordings of conversations with HOA members. Every interaction, every decision, every misstep, they were all meticulously recorded, building a case that would expose the HOA as hypocrisy. As tensions mounted, so did the stakes. Residents found themselves caught in the crossfire, torn between supporting the guy and siding with the HOA. Friendships fractured, alliances shifted, and trust eroded. What had once been a close-knit community now felt like a powder keg, ready to explode at any moment. But amidst the chaos, something unexpected happened. People started talking, not yelling or arguing, but actually talking. Conversations began, cropping up around dinner tables, at coffee shops, and during evening walks along the lake. At first, they were cautious, hesitant even. But gradually, walls came down, and truths emerged. One homeowner admitted she'd always hated the HOA's authoritarian approach, but never dared speak up. Another confessed he'd suspected the bridge demolition was unnecessary, but assumed someone else would raise the issue. Slowly but surely, cracks appeared in the facade of unity the HOA had worked so hard to maintain. For the first time, residents realized they weren't alone in their frustrations. There were others who felt the same. Way others who might be willing to stand together if push came to shove. Back at the cabin, the guy sensed the tide was turning. He didn't know exactly how or when, but he could feel it. The HOA was losing ground, both legally and socially. Their bullying tactics, once effective, now seemed desperate, and while he still had a long road ahead, he knew he was winning. Not just the argument, but something deeper, a chance to reclaim his dignity, his voice, and his home. Late one night, as he sat on the porch watching the stars reflect off the lake, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. Had it been worth it? The sleepless nights, the endless arguments, the weight of standing alone against an entire organization? Maybe. Maybe not. But one thing was certain. He'd fought for what he believed in, and that counted for something. Little did he know, the real battle was yet to come. The legal battle between the guy with the cabin and the HOA dragged on for months, each side digging deeper into their trenches. Court dates were set, postponed, and rescheduled. Lawyers exchanged thick stacks of documents filled with technical jargon that no one outside the courtroom truly understood. Meanwhile, life in the gated community continued to spiral out of control. For the guy with the cabin, this period was a test of endurance. He spent countless hours meeting with his lawyer, reviewing case files, and strategizing how to counter every move the HOA made. It wasn't just about winning anymore, it was about proving a point. Every email he'd saved, every photo he'd taken, every recording of conversations became ammunition in his fight. His lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who thrived on taking down bullies, was impressed by his preparation. "You're ready for this," she told him during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "They underestimated you, and now they're paying the price." But it wasn't easy. The stress weighed heavily on him. There were days when he questioned whether all of this was worth it. Was he letting anger consume him? Could he have handled things differently? These thoughts haunted him, especially at night when the silence of the lake stretched endlessly around him. Yet, whenever doubt crept in, he reminded himself of why he was doing this, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever felt powerless against an organization like the HOA. While the guy focused on the legal fight, the HOA struggled to hold itself together. The board members, once confident in their authority, began to crack under the pressure. Arguments erupted during meetings, accusations flew, and alliances crumbled. Some members wanted to cut their losses and settle with the guy, offering to rebuild the bridge and drop the lawsuit. Others insisted on pushing forward, convinced they could still win if they threw enough money at the problem. The divide within the HOA spilled over into the community. Residents started taking sides, some openly supporting the guy and others sticking firmly with the HOA. Tensions ran high, and what little peace remained in the neighborhood vanished completely. People avoided eye contact at the mailbox or hurried past each other on the street. Conversations turned awkward, strained, or downright hostile. What had once been a quiet lakeside retreat now felt like a war zone. Amidst the chaos, an unexpected ally emerged. A retired journalist who owned a cabin in the community reached out to the guy one evening. She introduced herself as someone who admired his determination and believed the HOA had overstepped its bounds. "This story needs to be told," she said. "Not just for you, but for everyone who's ever been pushed around by people like them." At first, the guy hesitated. He wasn't looking for fame or attention, he just wanted justice. But the journalist explained her plan: document everything, expose the HOA's unethical practices, and rally public support. She promised to handle it carefully, avoiding anything that might violate privacy laws or YouTube policies. After some thought, he agreed. If telling his story could help others stand up for themselves, then it was worth it. Together, they launched a campaign to bring attention to the situation. They posted updates on social media, sharing photos of the demolished bridge, screenshots of dismissive emails from the HOA and videos of residents talking about how the conflict had affected their lives. They wrote articles for local newspapers, gave interviews to radio stations, and even created a petition calling for greater transparency and accountability in homeowners associations. The response was overwhelming. Within days, thousands of people across the country were following the story, commenting, sharing, and cheering him on. The HOA panicked. Suddenly, their actions were under a microscope, scrutinized by strangers who didn't hesitate to call them out. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a David versus Goliath battle between an ordinary homeowner and a powerful organization. Comment sections lit up with messages of support for the guy, many of which echoed similar experiences with HOAs in other communities. The tide was turning, and the HOA knew it. Despite the growing pressure, the HOA refused to back down. Lawyers filed motions, requested extensions, and tried every trick in the book to delay the inevitable. But the longer the fight dragged on, the more it cost them, not just financially, but in terms of reputation. Donors withdrew funding, potential buyers backed out of deals, and current residents began threatening to withhold dues. The once unshakable organization was crumbling from the inside out. Meanwhile, the guy found strength in the support he received. Messages poured in from people all over the world, thanking him for standing up and sharing their own stories of fighting against unfair systems. Strangers sent care packages filled with snacks, books, and notes of encouragement. Even some of his neighbors, who had initially sided with the HOA, quietly admitted they admired his courage. One day, while sorting through another stack of mail, he came across a letter from a young couple who had recently bought a cabin in the community. "We didn't know what we were getting into," they wrote, "but seeing how you've stood your ground has inspired us to speak up too. Thank you for showing us that change is possible." Reading those words brought tears to his eyes. For so long, he'd felt alone in this fight, like he was shouting into the void. Now, he realized he wasn't alone at all. He was part of something bigger, a movement, however small, toward fairness and accountability. As the court date approached, both sides prepared for what would likely be the final showdown. The HOA threw everything they had left into one last-ditch effort to discredit the guy, questioning his motives and accusing him of exaggerating the impact of the bridge demolition. But their arguments fell flat. The evidence spoke for itself. The destroyed bridge, the locked gate, the documented negligence. Even the judge seemed skeptical of the HOA's claims. On the morning of the trial, the guy arrived at the courthouse feeling a mix of nerves and determination. This was it, the moment he'd been working toward for months. As he sat in the courtroom, listening to the lawyers argue back and forth, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he'd come. From the day they tore down the bridge to now, he'd faced challenges he never imagined he'd overcome. Yet here he was, standing tall, refusing to back down. When the verdict finally came, it was clear that justice had prevailed. The HOA was ordered to rebuild the original bridge at their expense and drop all charges against the guy. More importantly, they were required to involve residents in future decisions, ensuring transparency moving forward. As he walked out of the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and supporters, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. The fight wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And though the road ahead would still have its challenges, he knew one thing for sure. Sometimes, standing your ground is the only way to make a difference. The courtroom verdict came as a shock to everyone except the guy with the cabin. After months of legal battles, sleepless nights, and relentless fighting, he finally had his win. The judge's ruling was clear. The HOA would rebuild the original bridge at their own expense, drop all charges against him, and commit to involving residents in future decisions. It was a victory not just for him, but for anyone who had ever felt powerless against an organization that seemed untouchable. As he stepped out of the courthouse, blinking in the bright sunlight, he was greeted by a crowd of supporters. Some were neighbors who had quietly cheered him on from the sidelines. Others were strangers who had followed his story online. Reporters shoved microphones in his face, asking how it felt to take on the HOA and win. He smiled a rare, genuine smile and said simply, "It feels like justice." But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end of the road. Winning the lawsuit didn't erase everything that had happened. The scars ran deep for him, for the community, and even for the HOA itself. Trust had been broken, relationships strained, and the once peaceful lakeside retreat now carried the weight of months of conflict. Still, there was hope. Hope that things could heal, slowly but surely. In the weeks that followed, life began to return to some semblance of normalcy. Construction crews arrived to rebuild the bridge, working quickly to restore access to the community. Residents cautiously ventured back outside, greeting each other with tentative smiles. Conversations that had been avoided for months started happening again at the mailbox, over coffee, or while walking along the lake. People admitted they'd learned something through all of this, that standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, can spark change. The guy with the cabin kept a low profile during this time. He didn't want to rub his victory in anyone's face, nor did he crave attention. Instead, he focused on rebuilding his own sense of peace. For so long, his life had revolved around the fight, the endless meetings, the late-night strategizing, the emotional toll of standing alone. Now he wanted to reclaim the simplicity he'd once cherished. So he spent his days fishing, reading, and tending to his garden. Slowly, the anger and frustration that had fueled him began to fade, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. But the world hadn't forgotten about him or his story. The journalist who had helped him document the battle turned her notes into a book. Titled Bridge Wars, One Man's Fight Against Corporate Greed, it became an instant bestseller. Readers were captivated by the tale of resilience and determination, seeing themselves in the struggles of the guy with the cabin. They wrote letters thanking him for inspiring them to stand up for themselves, whether against HOAs, employers, or any other system that tried to silence them. When the royalties from the book started rolling in, the guy decided to donate his share to environmental causes. He'd always cared deeply about nature. It was one of the reasons he loved his cabin so much, and he wanted to leave a positive legacy behind. "This fight wasn't just about me," he told the journalist during an interview. "It was about fairness, respect, and protecting what matters. If I can do something good with this, then maybe it'll all be worth it." Back at the lake, the rebuilt bridge stood as a symbol of resilience. It wasn't flashy or modern. It was sturdy, practical, and exactly what the community needed. The guy crossed it often, marveling at how something so simple could hold so much meaning. Each time he drove over it, he thought about the journey he'd been through. The anger, the doubt, the moments of triumph, they were all part of who he was now. That not everyone welcomed him back with open arms. Some neighbors still resented him for the chaos he'd caused, muttering under their breath whenever they passed him on the street. Others remained grateful, stopping to thank him for standing up when no one else would. Over time, though, the tension eased. Life moved forward, as it always does, and people found ways to coexist despite their differences. For the guy with the cabin, the experience changed him in ways he never expected. He was more cautious now, wary of trusting authority figures or assuming others had his best interests at heart. But he was also stronger, more confident in his ability to navigate challenges. Most importantly, he learned the power of standing your ground, not out of spite but out of principle. Today, The cabin by Lake Evergreen is still his sanctuary, though he visits less frequently than before. When he does go, he takes a moment to sit on the porch, watching the water ripple under the moonlight. Sometimes, he thinks about the bridge and the battle that tore his world apart and brought it back together again. He knows the scars will always be there, hidden beneath the surface like ripples in the lake. But he also knows that healing is possible, that bridges, both literal and metaphorical, can be rebuilt. And that sometimes, standing your ground isn't just about winning, it's about showing the world that fairness and respect are worth fighting for. As he sips his coffee and listens to the gentle lapping of the waves, he feels a sense of peace wash over him. The fight may have cost him dearly, but it gave him something far greater, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope can shine through. And for that, he'll always be grateful.